Right. So, Linda, here we are. Pleasure to have you here. You're an expert in pollination. I suspect that not a great deal of people know much about pollination. Can you explain what pollination is?
What pollination is? Well, first of all, the problem is that most people take pollination for granted, and most people don't know what it is. What pollination is the movement of pollen from one flower to the male part. Pollen is the male part, so it's movement of pollen from one flower to another flower. And that process can happen by wind or water or usually by animals. And most of our pollination in the world, for most of our flowering plants, requires an animal pollinator.
Sounds pretty simple, but it's vital. Why is it so important?
Well, the reason why pollination is so important to us and why we shouldn't be taking it for granted is because our food depends on it. About 25% or 1 out of every 4 mouthfuls of food that you eat is dependent on a pollinator for transferring the pollen for you to be able to get that food, the fruit and the seeds.
That's a remarkable statistic.
And then even more than that, about 75%, if you look at the number of different types of food you eat, like the number of species of crops that you eat, 75% of those, the diversity, depend upon animal pollinators. So we, for our food security and for our health, our well-being, we depend on animal pollinators. On top of that, the native plant communities that we have, they depend on animal pollinators as well. So it's crucial.
And what's better, it's free.
Yes, and it's called, what we call it in scientific terms is an ecosystem service. And an ecosystem service is something that nature gives us for free. We usually take it for granted until it's taken away from us. And pollination is the free service by pollinators to give us our food and to reproduce our native plants.
Now, I heard somebody talking not so long ago about the global pollinator crisis. What is it, and what are the causes?
Well, the global pollinator crisis is something that people have been worried about for a while. It started way back in the 1960s. People were worried about pesticides. But by the 1990s, in the middle of the 1990s, people actually started calling it a pollinator crisis globally, in North America, in Brazil, and the Convention on Biological Diversity started a program to look at agriculture and the loss of pollinators. So the global pollinator crisis is the problem that we are losing the number of pollinators we have, and we're also losing the species. We're losing the diversity of pollinators that we have. And so it's a serious crisis worldwide.
And what about the situation here in good old New Zealand?
Well, the problem with the pollinator crisis is the global decline in pollinators come from loss of habitats, misusing pesticides, the introduction of the spread of diseases and pests like the varroa mite getting the honeybees, and changes in seasonality that could come from climate change. And those kinds of causes are happening everywhere around the world. But New Zealand is special because New Zealand is an isolated, remote oceanic island. And in the southern hemisphere, we don't know very much about our pollinators. In the southern hemisphere, practically, well, especially in the oceanic islands, hardly anything is known about pollination and who the pollinators are. Now, the difficulty the oceanic islands have is that they're small, they're isolated, they have very low genetic diversity, they have very few pollinator species, and so extinctions happen very fast, recovery is very difficult because on a continental landmass you'll have other sources for species to come in and replace what you've lost. We don't have that on oceanic islands. So New Zealand is vulnerable, and most of the oceanic islands are probably pretty vulnerable as well.
And what pollinators do we have here?
Well, it's interesting in New Zealand because we have a mix of pollinators that is not the same as Australia or California or those other countries.
And that's because we're an island? We're unique?
Yes, it's because we're an island, and what we have here are 6 major groups of pollinators. We have our large animals. That includes the birds, the bats, and the lizards. Not very many places the rest of the world. Other oceanic islands have lizards, but it's very uncommon. So we have one group is large animals. Now the next group we have in New Zealand are introduced for agriculture. 150 years ago, they brought in the bumblebee and the honeybee. These are large bees. They're big, they're furry, they're good pollinators. They go to lots of different plants. And these bees are used in agriculture, but they've also escaped and gone into the native plant communities. That means that they're out there pollinating our native plants too. And we have to think about what does that mean for our situation in New Zealand. And the problem is, many people think that the bumblebee and the honeybee we want to get rid of them, and it's fine that we got varroa mite, let's get rid of the honeybee, we don't want the honeybee in the wild. But my interpretation from my research is that the honeybee and the bumblebee are big pollinators compared to our other bees, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And they could easily be replacing for those flowers that require the large animals. So if we know that the birds and the bats and the lizards, those populations have been decimated on the mainland. And so if the honeybee and the bumblebee can go to a flower that used to have a bird or a bat, or not so much the lizard, but mainly the birds, then the honeybee and bumblebee could be transferring lots of pollen. And so they're our friends, they're not a foe. However, it's mixed. There's a paradox in New Zealand with pollination because the honeybee and the bumblebee also are instrumental in spreading weeds. There are some weeds like broom and gorse that really require a bumblebee or a honeybee. And the reason why they require a honeybee or a bumblebee is because these flowers are closed flowers. In order to open up, you need a big, strong bee. If you didn't have the honeybee or the bumblebee, those flowers would not set seed. That means you wouldn't be spreading gorse or broom. So in that sense, it's a detrimental to have the honeybee and bumblebee escaped into the wild. And the other problem is that the honeybee and the bumblebee, they're nice big pollinators. They need lots of nectar and pollen. And if you overstock them, like say you're putting them out into the wild for extracting honey, in the case of the honeybee, if you put out too many, they might use up all the nectar and pollen that our native bees need. And so if the honeybee and bumblebee are displacing our native bees, that's a problem. If they're spreading weeds, that's a problem. But if they are in fact doing the crucial pollination that we need, that we can't get because the birds are gone, the bats are gone, then they're our friends. So this is the paradox of the New Zealand pollination situation. And that paradox may be true for other Oceania islands as well. It depends on which mix of pollinators that you have.
So we've talked about a couple of the groups, but there are also some others.
Yes, there's about 4 other groups, and they are the native bees, the flies, the butterflies and moths, and the beetles. Now the native bees, there's about 32 species of native bees, and they have very interesting habits, which I'll talk about later. But these are the bees that to me, they are the workhorses of the New Zealand in the native systems. They're after the birds and the bats, they're the workhorses, because they go to a lot of flowers and they transfer a lot of pollen. Then there's the fly group. Now that's an interesting group because you think the flies don't really carry pollen, but some of them carry a lot of pollen. And in New Zealand, a lot of people don't know the difference between a fly and a native bee because they look fairly similar if you're not looking too closely. And so the flies, we don't know a lot about them. We don't know if their populations are declining. We don't know if the native bee populations are declining. We know so little about our New Zealand pollinators. After that, we have the butterflies and the moths. We know a little bit more about butterflies because of the Monarch Butterfly Trust, and we know what the habits of butterflies are. And the beetles are an interesting group that we also don't know very much about.
We're at a gardening show, so what can gardeners do to help reduce the pollinator crisis?
Well, there's a movement overseas that a lot of gardeners in England and in California and other places, people are starting to plant butterfly gardens, they're starting to plant bee gardens, and they're starting to understand that what they plant in their garden will make a difference for attracting in pollinators. But in New Zealand, it's interesting because in California, we have a very big program for attracting bees in, and they know how to do it. But we don't know that much about our bees. If you wanted to attract butterflies and have a butterfly garden, we know that what we have to do is plant swan plant for the monarch, which is an introduced butterfly. For our native red admiral and yellow admiral butterfly, you need to plant stinging nettle because the caterpillars, the larvae, they need that plant. Without that, they're not going to lay eggs and make new butterflies. So we know a lot about what their favorite plants are, but for bees, we don't know that much. We're doing research at Langcare with our community pollination project to investigate which flowers our native bees and our flies and our moths, etc., which pollinator likes which type of flower. So we are getting the information in, but it's not out to the public yet. And these bees, if you want, here's the bees. I've got a poster here.
I'll hold it.
These are the bees of New Zealand. It's a poster that you can get this poster at Langcare Research. And what you see on this poster, if you look closely, you'll see this is the honeybee. That's what its face looks like. And this one is a bumblebee, and that one's a bumblebee, and that's another bumblebee over there. But then there's this very funny bee which has little yellow marks, and it's called the masked bee. There's another one and another one. That's called Hylaeus. And Hylaeus is a solitary bee, and it nests in wood. And in your garden, if you want to bring this bee in, you would put little sticks of wood out with holes of the right size drilled in it. And they also, another characteristic of them is that they eat the pollen. So they carry the pollen in their crop. And then when they get to their nest, they regurgitate the pollen and make a little mass of pollen, put the egg in there, and that's what their offspring grow on. So this Hylaeus bee, the masked bee, is very special, and you could probably attract it into your garden if you had the twig nests or the wood blocks for the nests, and if you had its plants, like it loves flax plant. So it loves the pollen from flax. These other bees, the ones that have the hairy faces,
yes,
they are mostly Lasioglossum, and especially the bigger one, Lioproctus. Lioproctus is almost as big as the smallest honeybee, the worker honeybee. And those Lioproctus and those Lasioglossums, what they do is that they nest in the ground. So if you're out hiking in the bush and you see a bunch of holes on a cliff, some of those holes are nests that these bees nest in. So the female makes a solitary little tunnel. She's alone. They're not colonies like bumblebees and honeybees. And they will go into the nest. And these bees, the Lioproctus, the ones with the funny beard, they actually pack the pollen on their legs. And so they're a little bit better pollinators than Hylaeus. Now, if you wanted to bring those into your garden, what you have to do is have their favorite plants, and they love the native broom, and there's other plants, there's even exotic plants they love, but you've also got to have a place for them to nest. Now, either there has to be a place nearby your house or nearby in the area, or you can make a place in your own garden. Now, that might be tricky. You might have to experiment with it a little bit, but you could do it. If you had a big enough lot or you had enough bare ground, sometimes we found these bees, they nest right underneath the native broom. So if you kept that clear and don't mulch it, so in a way the message to the gardeners is don't clean up everything and don't mulch everything if you want to have a bee garden. It would be very new for people in New Zealand to start having bee gardens. The research has just started, and I don't think anyone's really tried it much yet, so it's all new territory for us.
I guess also gardeners have another important role, as do parents and teachers, everyone, and that is one of education. Bees are not something, bees and all pollinators aren't something to be afraid of.
Yes. In fact, my neighbor told me that she didn't like moths because they're beasties, but in fact, moths pollinate at night, butterflies pollinate in the day, bees pollinate in the daytime. These are our friends. And if you're afraid of a pollinator and you think it's going to sting you and or you want to squash it and kill it because it's a bug, we mustn't do that. These are our friends. We need them. We need them for our food. We need them for diversity in our diet, and we need them to keep our native plants going. And you need them in your own garden. So they're our friends, not our foe. And it's important for children to learn to love those little pollinators because they are our ecosystem service, a free gift from nature.
Linda, informative as always. Thank you very much for your time. It's great having you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.